In the beginning, in the very beginning, the Great Spirit created gifts for the first people. The first people were the animal people who were here before us, and each of the animal people received a gift in a cedar box, a beautiful cedar box, painted, painted with the colorful juices of berries, blackberries and salal berries. And each of the people, the first people, took their gifts and they opened them up and they shared them with everyone. The very first box contained all the water of the world. And the water came up and rose high up into the sky and then fell down as rain. And the rain formed streams, and streams flowed into rivers, and the rivers flowed into the sea. And another box was opened. And in that box were all the mountains of the world, and they were placed in all the places where they are to this day. And another box was opened, and in that box were the seeds of all living things, the seeds of grasses and flowers and trees. And another box, wind came out, and the wind blew the seeds to all the corners of the world. One by one, each of the boxes, the cedar boxes given by the Great Spirit, were opened and shared by the first people. Every box except for one. And that was the box that was given to Seagull. And in that box was all the light of the world. And so in the beginning, in the very beginning, in the beginning there was no light. There was only night. Now, the first people all asked Seagull to open the box so that there might be light. Oh, they asked Seagull many times, all of them, and well, Seagull just clutched that cedar box under one wing and held tightly and was so very pleased that people were begging him to share the light. But he wouldn't. And so the first people were frustrated and angry, and they turned to Raven. Raven, who was Seagull's cousin. And they said to Raven, "You're his cousin. Certainly you will be able to get him to open the box so that there will be light." Well, Raven flew to where Seagull was, and the two of them were there, perched side by side. One was mostly white and the other was mostly black, but you couldn't see either of them, for there was no light. There was only night. Raven said, "Seagull, what do you have in the box?" And Seagull said, "Oh, you know what I have in the box, and I'm not showing it to you either." And so it began. Raven asked. Raven begged. Raven pleaded. Raven flattered. Raven threatened. But no matter what Raven did, Seagull just held that box ever more tightly. And Raven was so angry that Raven thought to Raven's self, "Oh, I wish Seagull had a thorn in Seagull's foot." And because whatever Raven thinks, whatever Raven imagines happens, at that moment Seagull cried out, "Oh, my foot, it hurts." And Raven, seated right beside Seagull, said, "Oh, my cousin, let me help." And so Raven reached down. Raven knew exactly where the thorn was, of course. And finding the thorn, well, now maybe you and I would have pulled the thorn out, but Raven didn't. Instead, Raven pushed it in more deeply. Oh, and Seagull cried out again. It hurts, it hurts. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm sorry. I'm sorry, my cousin. But there's not enough light for me to see. If I only had more light, a little bit of light. And so with great reluctance, Seagull took the lid and lifted the lid ever so slightly, just a crack. And out of that crack came little bits of light that went up into the dark sky. And Raven looked up. And Raven saw that it was so beautiful. For it was Raven who first saw the stars. But while Raven was admiring the beauty of the stars at night, Seagull was complaining. Here, let me try again, my cousin. But I really need a little more light. Open the box some more. And because the foot hurt, and for no other reason, Seagull, whimpering and crying, took the box and lifted it up, the lid up just enough so a pale round light came out and floated up into the sky. And it was Raven who first saw the beauty of that pale round light. It was Raven who first saw the moon. Oh, and it was so beautiful. But of course, Seagull was still complaining, and Raven said Raven would, oh, my cousin Seagull, I need more light. Open that box some more. And Seagull, oh. Well, you know what happened, don't you? Seagull wouldn't open the box until Raven tried one more time to pull the thorn out, except he didn't pull the thorn out. What did he do? He pushed it in as deep as he could. And Seagull threw both wings up, and the box tumbled away from him, and the lid came off, and out of the box shot all the bright light of the world. Up, a fiery, bright light, round and blazing in the sky. It was so bright that even Raven couldn't look straight at it. And Raven finally looked up, and Raven was the first one to see the sun. And so in the very beginning, at the beginning of time, there was light. And that is part of the story of how light came into the world, as told by many of the native peoples of the Pacific Northwest, Oregon, Washington, Alaska, British Columbia. And this particular version that I tell is from the Nootka people of Vancouver Island. And I've got a little bit of a story to tell you how I came across this story. And that is in the next video. I'm Bob Wilhelm. I'm a storyteller. Seagull, Raven, and the Coming of Light. This is a story that I have told for a long time, probably well over 40 years. It was a story that I use very frequently with children's audiences. And of course, the challenge was, how do you tell a story of a trickster who causes pain, but the pain is necessary in order for good things to happen? It was always an exciting challenge in working with kids with this story. In the 1980s, I moved to Washington State, to the Key Peninsula near Gig Harbor, near Tacoma on Puget Sound. It was a very, very dark place. I lived in the woods, surrounded by very, very tall fir trees, Douglas fir. And it was at the edge of the finger of Puget Sound where there were oyster beds. And many, many times in this very dark environment, I had moved from California and did not realize that the Pacific Northwest was not the place anyone wanted to go if they loved light. I would frequently walk down to, at low tide, down to the area where the mudflats were, put on my waterproof boots and kind of slog and slop across the tidal flats. It would give me a greater exposure to the sky, and even though the sky was gray most of the time, it was far better than being deep in that forest where everything was so very, very dark. Now, one day when I was walking the mudflats at low tide, I saw a seagull, and the seagull did not move as I approached it. It would normally flutter and fly away as someone walked towards it. But as I got closer, I could see that it was flapping its wings and it was struggling because, as I got very, very close, I could see that its foot, its claw, was caught in a shell. It was a large shell, and Seagull couldn't extract, and Seagull was trapped because the tide would change. And when the tide changed, if Seagull could not escape, well, I walked very slowly and carefully. Seagull didn't move. I knelt down in front of Seagull. And I reached forward, and again, Seagull was very still. I reached and I gently pried the shell open, and pulling the shell apart as gently as I could, pulled Seagull's trapped foot out. I pulled back, arose, Seagull fluffed. I stepped back some more. Seagull spread Seagull's wings and flew to freedom. Let me tell you another story. I lived in the Pacific Northwest in that place for 2 years. It was very hard. I was about 40 years old, and the darkness was very depressing. It was really, in some ways, the hardest 2 years of my life, though Puget Sound was beautiful. It was still hard. When we came back to Washington, D.C., in 1986, in the coming year, my wife Kelly was listening to a talk show on radio. She came home where I was, and she had written down a phone number and a name. She said, "I want you to call him because you have this disease." Well, she explained that Dr. Norman Rosenthal at the National Institute of Health in Washington had given an interview and had asked for volunteers who suffered from seasonal affective disorder, as he called it, he named it, to be part of a research project. And I agreed. Surprisingly, I normally would not have. And I called Dr. Rosenthal, made an appointment, went in, and I was a bit nervous. There he was with his white coat and his legal pad, and he was a psychiatrist, and there was something wrong with me, and I didn't know exactly what it was, and I didn't really want to know what it was, but I just trusted that I should be there. The interview was to go for about a half an hour. He sat down. After 5 minutes, he put his legal pad aside. And he looked at me and he says, "You have one of the most severe cases of seasonal affective disorder that I have ever seen. There's no need to continue with the interview. I'd like to ask you to be in the program for a year. We can help you, and you can help us." And so I began involvement actually for 2 years, using light therapy and some other interventions that explored the nature of this malady. I was written up in his book, which has been revised, and in the revision, as it became more popular, my chapter on me disappeared, but the original book has a chapter on me. And he believed, Norman Rosenthal believed, that there were ways of coping with seasonal affective disorder, or in its milder form, something that affects more people, the winter blues, winter depression. And so he interviewed a number of artists, visual artists, and one verbal artist, myself. He came to our apartment in Washington, D.C., and he asked me to tell some stories because he knew I was a storyteller and so forth. And I think the very first story that I told was Seagull, Raven, and the Coming of Light. Norman explained to me later that his thesis was, his guess was, that by telling the story, I was able to create in my mind's eye, not just in my imagination, but physically, sort of the neuron connections working backwards. I was able to trigger the light that I was seeking, and I received momentary relief seeing the light in the story. There were other stories I told as well, and as he pointed out, and I had never considered it before, all the other stories that he listened to that day also had light as the key element of each of the stories. So I still tell the story. The story is a lovely story, a delightful story, a challenging story, because of its moral implications. How do you deal with suffering? How do you deal with darkness? What's the struggle between good and evil? What does one do so that one does not inflict more pain on others? But sometimes when pain happens, sometimes good things come out of it. It's complex, but it's like life. It's just like life. There are no easy answers. It's complex. So these are the two stories that are the background for my telling of the story from the Nootka people on the coming of light. Please feel free to share the stories. This is a folk tale that is, I think, a powerful one. It's a simple one. It's a fun one to tell. And please come back and listen to some of my other stories as well. I'm Bob Wilhelm. I'm a storyteller. See you next time.